Acts of the Apostles, chapter 18, verse 9. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man shall attack you to harm you, for I have many people in this city." And he stayed a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack upon Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading men to worship God, contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, I should have reason to bear with you, O Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to this. Verse 18. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria. So Paul remains many days longer, and it's during this time that Paul writes his letters to the Thessalonians. You want to make a note at verse 18 that at this moment, Paul writes his letters to the Thessalonians. And so what we'll do is when we come to the point when Paul writes the letter, we'll jump to the epistle and give a brief overview of it. So if you flip to the end of Acts, after Acts in the New Testament are the Pauline epistles, letters written by Paul, and they're organized into two groups. Letters that Paul writes to communities, and then letters that Paul writes to individuals. The communities are organized by length, from longest to shortest. And then the individuals are organized by length as well, longest to shortest, not by chronology. All right, and so the first and second letter to the Thessalonians are actually very short. So they're towards the end of the communal letters. So keep turning along, go past Romans, go past Galatians, go past Ephesians, past Colossians, until you get to the first letter to the Thessalonians. All right, so at the first letter to the Thessalonians, you want to make the following notes just to have in reference for when in your own studies you go back and you return to this text. This is the oldest complete document in the New Testament. The oldest written work in the New Testament is the letter from the Council of Jerusalem. However, that letter doesn't take up its own place in the New Testament. It's just contained within the book of Acts. 1 Thessalonians is the oldest complete work of the New Testament that we have in the Bible. Make a note here also that to Acts 18, verse 18, so you can go back and overview the historical circumstances that Paul is living through, if need be. And then you also make note this is the first Pauline letter. So the themes that First Thessalonians deals with is that Paul is answering questions regarding death and the second coming of Christ. Remember, in Thessalonica, Paul only had 3 weeks with those people. So he had 3 weekends of preaching and mentioned, what happens after death, what's going to take place in the second coming, or that he mentions that Christ is going to come again. And in Thessalonica, there's confusion as to exactly what the second coming is going to consist of. And so how this would have happened is someone would have written to Paul, sent a messenger to Paul about the confusion in the community. And then Paul would sit down to compose the response. And this is the response. We don't have the initial message that was given to him that prompted him to write, but we can assume that because of the topics he addresses, that the confusion was regarding death and the second coming. So after First Thessalonians, go ahead and keep turning, then jump to Second Thessalonians. And Second Thessalonians is the next letter that Paul wrote to the church of Thessalonica. So Paul explained things about death and the second coming of Christ. And then what we can infer based on Second Thessalonians is that that church wrote a response and then sought some further clarification regarding what Paul wrote in First Thessalonians. And so then Second Thessalonians is written to go over and clarify what the congregation did not understand from First Thessalonians. All right, and so that's a really good example of how these letters have a historical context, and how in order to understand, you have to understand the audience, the author's relationship with the audience. Right, it was a brief relationship that Paul had with them, so there's a lot of further explanation that needed to be done on certain points. Okay, and so that is all we're going to cover about First and Second Thessalonians, oldest New Testament documents. Paul's first epistles, wrote to Thessalonica, a place where he stayed only 3 weeks. So after this, Paul stayed many days longer, returning back to Acts chapter 18, verse 18. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, he cut his hair, for he had a vow, and they came to Ephesus. Ephesus, right? He's at Ephesus. This is going to be another Pauline church, and he's going to write a letter to the Ephesians. And he left them there. All right, he left Priscilla and Aquila there. But he himself went into the synagogue and argued with the Jews. When they'd asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, "I will return to you if God wills." And he set sail from Ephesus.